Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material. So I want you to imagine the last time you were just truly, overwhelmingly anxious about something.
Oh, we've all been there.
Right. Like you're convinced a relationship is falling apart, or maybe a massive project at work is just completely collapsing, and your brain is just misfiring.
Yeah, total panic mode.
Exactly. So you open your phone to send a text to try and, fix the situation. And you write this frantic, massive paragraph.
Which you immediately realize sounds totally unhinged.
Yes. So you delete it. Then you try writing like 3 aggressive bullet points. You delete those 2. And eventually you just send this barrage of chaotic, overanalyzed fragments that honestly make absolutely no sense.
Because it's not eloquent, it's just pure panic.
Right. It's panic. Now, what if I told you that the most piercing, accurate psychological breakdown of that exact modern anxiety was actually written over 200 years ago?
What?
Yeah. And it was analyzing plays written 400 years ago. So for today's deep dive, we are focusing on the brilliant 19th century essayist William Hazlitt. We're looking at his commentary on William Shakespeare, specifically The Winter's Tale and All's Well That Ends Well, and we're also taking a really fascinating detour into the Italian master Boccaccio.
Which is such rich material to dig into.
It really is.
Yeah.
We are pulling the absolute best insights from these sources to see what they can tell us about our own minds today.
We are definitely holding up a mirror today. I mean, our goal here is to look way past the velvet theatrical costumes and the Elizabethan staging.
Right, the stuff that makes it feel distant.
Exactly. We want to get past that dense 19th century prose and really extract the raw psychological truths that Hazlitt managed to identify, because he had this just uncanny ability to diagnose the human condition through literature.
He really did.
So we're going to explore things like the suffocating mechanics of jealousy, the immense courage that unrequited love actually requires, and the bizarre freedom of being exposed as an absolute fraud.
Which I can't wait to get into.
Yeah, and we'll also touch on this surprisingly timeless debate over what actually constitutes the natural world.
So knowing your own mind is really the mission here. By the end of this deep dive, the way you view workplace conflicts, romantic pursuits, or even just how you process information on social media, it might look entirely different.
I think it definitely will.
So I want to jump straight into what Hazlitt calls the anatomy of human passion. Specifically, let's look at a character who completely destroys his own life. Leontes, the king in The Winter's Tale.
Oh, Leontes is such a tragic spiral.
Right. He spirals into this pure, unadulterated jealousy. He is entirely convinced his wife is being unfaithful. And Hazlitt describes Leontes' speeches as having this, quote, crabbed and tortuous style. He argues that Leontes' mind is entangled more and more in a thorny labyrinth.
And that insight, the insight Hazlitt pulls from that crab style, is so profound because it totally challenges our standard expectations of what great literature should be.
How so?
Well, we usually expect characters in these moments of really high drama to deliver these sweeping, perfectly eloquent soliloquies.
Oh, yeah. Like they suddenly become poets right when their life is falling apart.
Exactly. But Hazlitt identifies Shakespeare's true genius in the fact that he makes Leontes sound incredibly fragmented.
Just broken up and chaotic.
Yeah. The writing captures what Hazlitt calls the painful struggle of different thoughts and feelings, laboring for utterance, and I love this phrase, almost strangled in the birth.
Strangled in the birth. That is such a visceral way to describe it.
It is. Because the core wisdom here is recognizing that genuine destructive emotion is fundamentally disorienting. When you are totally consumed by paranoia or jealousy, your cognitive function basically just collapses under the weight of that passion.
So the words fail because the emotion itself is too chaotic to actually be organized into pretty poetry.
Precisely.
That phrase, strangled in the birth, it captures the actual physiological sensation of anxiety so well. I mean, it's that feeling of having a massive, terrifying emotion welling up in your chest, but when it hits your throat, it just chokes you.
You literally can't get it out.
Right. You can't articulate it, and because you can't articulate it clearly, you get more frustrated, which just makes the labyrinth even thornier.
Yeah, the physiological reality of what you're describing, that cognitive overload, is exactly what Leontes is experiencing. Hazlitt says he is confounded with his passion and does not know which way to turn himself.
Which is terrifying.
It is. He tries to rationalize his delusion, but because the foundational premise is flawed, I mean, his wife is entirely innocent, His brain has to perform these torturous gymnastics just to make the pieces fit.
He expects himself to make sense.
Right, he expects clarity. But the reality of uncontrolled passion is that it absolutely destroys our capacity for reason. The labyrinth is thorny because every single turn he takes to find a logical exit just cuts him deeper.
Wow. That makes so much sense, especially when you contrast it with the other side of the emotional spectrum that Hazlitt explores. Because after he breaks down this loud, chaotic passion, he introduces this concept of sentiment when he's talking about all's well that ends well and the works of Boccaccio.
Yes, sentiment, a very different kind of feeling.
But I'm going to be honest, I struggle a bit with his definition. He says true sentiment is the habitual workings of some one powerful feeling where the heart reposes almost entirely upon itself. I mean, to me, that sounds very passive.
It does sound passive to modern ears, for sure, but Hazlitt is actually describing a state of immense active endurance here.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Well, the dichotomy he's establishing is between destructive reactivity and constructive fortitude. Leontes is entirely reactive, right? He requires constant external validation for his delusions, and he spins wildly out of control when he doesn't get it.
He needs everyone to agree with his crazy theory.
Exactly. But then Hazlitt looks at a character like Helen in All's Well That Ends Well. Now, she loves a man who is socially far, far above her.
Right, totally out of her league, structurally speaking.
Yeah. And Hazlitt describes her love as possessing great sweetness and delicacy. The key phrase in his definition of sentiment is that the heart reposes almost entirely upon itself. It is entirely self-sustaining.
So it doesn't actually need the other person to fuel it. That feels almost like a superpower.
Or a terrible burden, depending on the circumstance.
Fair point.
But yes, the capacity to generate and sustain a powerful feeling without getting any external reward, that's what Hazlitt really admires. And he finds the ultimate expression of this in Boccaccio's tale of Federigo and his falcon.
Oh, this story is wild.
It really is. So Federigo is this man who spends his entire fortune trying to court a woman who does not return his affection at all.
Nothing. She gives him nothing.
Nothing. So he's reduced to absolute poverty. He's living on this tiny farm with literally nothing left to his name except his prized falcon.
His one last valuable possession.
Right. And then one day, the woman finally visits his farm. And out of this pure, unrequited devotion and just wanting to honor her, he secretly roasts his beloved falcon to serve her a meal that he feels is worthy of her station.
It's the ultimate sacrifice. I mean, he destroys the last thing of value he owns for someone who has never given him the time of day.
And Hazlitt points out that this kind of perseverance and attachment reveals a feeling that is just woven into the very fabric of the soul. It becomes involuntary.
It's just who he is at that point.
Exactly. We tend to view strength as this aggressive action, breaking down doors, confronting enemies, making loud demands.
Right. Very Leontes energy.
Yes. But the wisdom here is understanding emotional endurance as an alternative but immense form of human strength. Holding on to a single, pure intention without growing bitter, even when the world totally ignores you, that requires a psychological fortitude that makes Leontes' loud, thrashing paranoia look incredibly weak by comparison.
That is such a paradigm shift. Now, I want to pull back from the characters themselves for a moment and look at the historical context of how these plays were actually received, because I think it highlights a major blind spot in how we evaluate information today.
Okay, let's look at the context.
So the source material outlines this really fascinating literary debate about the so-called blemishes in The Winter's Tale. Alexander Pope, the famous 18th century poet, was so outraged by the play's factual inaccuracies that he actually claimed Shakespeare couldn't have even written it.
Yes, Pope was operating under this very strict neoclassical framework. That framework demanded rigid adherence to the unities of time, place, and action.
Meaning a play should basically take place in real time in one location.
Right. So when Shakespeare literally introduces a character named Time who walks on stage, turns an hourglass, and just announces that the story is skipping forward 16 years, Pope's analytical mind basically short-circuited.
And the geography.
Yeah.
He couldn't handle that the character Antigonus is described as landing his ship on the, quote, seacoast of Bohemia.
Right, because Bohemia was essentially modern-day Czechia.
Which is very famously landlocked. There is no seacoast. So Pope saw these structural and geographical errors and just concluded the work was sloppy and therefore it was illegitimate.
Which is exactly where Hazlitt steps in with a profoundly different metric for evaluating value. He dismisses Pope's shock entirely.
He really just brushes him off.
He does. Hazlitt argues that these slips don't disprove Shakespeare's authorship at all. I mean, Shakespeare was just as capable of making a geographical error as anyone else in the 17th century.
Sure, they didn't have Google Maps.
Exactly. The crucial point Hazlitt makes is that we don't know anyone but Shakespeare who could produce the play's actual beauties.
The tragedies, the comedy, that perfect capturing of the human soul we were just talking about.
Right.
Hazlitt is basically asking, why are you looking at a map when there is a masterpiece of human psychology right in front of you?
It's the classic error of missing the forest for the trees. Pope reviewed the play like an auditor, looking for accounting errors on a spreadsheet. But Hazlitt reviewed it as an explorer of the human condition.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
And if we apply this to our own lives, the context teaches us this vital lesson about dismissal. We frequently reject profound ideas or dismiss meaningful feedback or even completely write off complex people just because of a superficial blemish.
Oh, absolutely. Someone uses the wrong terminology, or a project proposal has a typo, or an idea just doesn't fit neatly into our pre-existing framework, and we just throw the whole thing out.
Right. Pope almost missed a masterpiece because he was utterly obsessed with technical perfection. Hazlitt teaches us to hunt for the underlying truth, regardless of how messy the packaging might be.
And that tension between the packaging and the essence really comes alive when Hazlitt talks about experiencing these plays in an actual theater.
Yes, the stage versus the page.
He recounts these incredibly vivid memories of seeing The Winter's Tale performed. He specifically praises these legendary actors of his time. Like, he talks about Mr. Kemble working himself into a classical frenzy as Leontes.
A great description.
And he mentions Mrs. Siddons playing the final scene where the statue of Hermione comes to life, noting her true monumental dignity. Plus, he mentions Bannister playing the sturdy beggar Autolycus.
So it's really important to understand what those specific names represented to a 19th century audience.
Right, they were superstars.
Massive superstars. Sarah Siddons was an absolute titan of the stage. She was known for this terrifying emotional intensity, but also incredible physical control. So for her to play a statue coming to life, that meant absolute breathtaking stillness, followed by a profound, agonizingly slow return to humanity.
That must have been incredible to watch.
Oh, definitely. And then John Philip Kemble, who was her brother, was famous for his very stately classical declamation. So when Hazlitt says Kemble fell into a classical frenzy, he's describing the breakdown of a highly ordered, majestic facade into just pure chaos.
Wow.
Hazlitt is taking this eternal text and anchoring it to these very specific mortal performances.
And that contrast actually brings out a deep melancholy in his essay, because he acknowledges that these incredible human vessels that carry the art, well, they're temporary.
They are.
He writes, actors grow old or no longer surprise us by their novelty. The magic of that specific performance on that specific night is just gone forever.
But notice how quickly he pivots away from that melancholy of the human condition and turns toward the immortality of the idea.
He doesn't wallow in it.
Not at all. The actor's age, the physical stage is rot, the 19th century audience completely disappears. But Hazlitt insists that, quote, true poetry, like nature, is always young.
I love that line.
He compares reading the courtship of the young lovers in the play, Florizel and Perdita, to welcoming the return of spring. So the human context of the aging performers really only serves to highlight the eternal youth of the art itself.
It's a very comforting thought, honestly. The specific circumstances of our lives change. We age, our careers shift, the technology changes. But the fundamental human experiences, that electric shock of young love, the agonizing grip of jealousy, the desperate need for forgiveness, those things are constantly renewing themselves in every single generation.
Because the mechanism of human emotion remains entirely untouched by time, which is exactly why bringing these ancient words into our 21st century realities is so seamless.
Let's do exactly that. Let's take mechanics of Leontes' paranoia and translate them to the modern world. Because there's a quote in Hazlitt's analysis that just stopped me dead in my tracks.
Which one?
So Leontes is spiraling. He's trying to manufacture proof that his wife is cheating on him with his best friend. And he launches into this manic series of questions. He says, quote, is whispering nothing? Is leaning cheek to cheek? Is meeting noses? Skulking in corners? Wishing clocks more swift?
Such a paranoid spiral.
Totally. He essentially concludes that if all these tiny little things mean nothing, then the sky and the whole world are nothing.
The psychological feedback loop happening in that speech is terrifyingly relevant today. Hazlitt points out that Leontes doesn't arrive at this conclusion through objective observation.
Not at all.
Right. He is, as Hazlitt says, oppressed with its own intensity. Leontes actually becomes convinced of his own rightness by insisting on his unjust suspicions to someone else. He takes these fears to his advisor, Camillo.
And Camillo tells him he's out of his mind. He basically says, this isn't happening, you're imagining things.
But rather than waking Leontes up, Camillo's opposition is exactly what Leontes needs.
He uses the pushback.
Exactly. He uses the friction of Camillo's denial to spark his own rage into a full blaze. He needs an enemy to validate the intensity of his feeling. I mean, if Camillo had just agreed with him, the paranoia might have actually deflated. But the pushback allows Leontes to dig his heels in deeper.
This is exactly how we process ambiguous information in our hyper-connected world. Think about confirmation bias on social media, or even just modern workplace paranoia.
Oh, absolutely.
You see two coworkers talking quietly by the coffee machine, you think, this whispering nothing. Or an email from your boss is slightly shorter than usual. A partner takes a few extra hours to text back. We take these tiny, completely neutral data points, and our anxiety weaves them into a massive, catastrophic narrative.
The modern translation here is a warning about living in a slippery world where reality is highly subjective. We are armed with endless data and unprecedented connectivity. It has literally never been easier to construct entirely fictional realities. We find these online echo chambers that validate our paranoia, or, just like Leontes, we actively seek out arguments with people who tell us we're wrong.
And then we use their resistance as proof that they must be part of the conspiracy.
Precisely. We manufacture clearer convictions simply by insisting upon them loudly enough. The human mind is just remarkably adept at taking ambiguous stimuli, meeting noses, wishing clocks more swished, and forging them into chains that oppress us.
It's a completely self-inflicted prison. But, the text also explores how we construct our identities in the face of all this pressure. There is a philosophical debate in The Winter's Tale that feels like it was written yesterday.
Yes, the flower debate.
Exactly. It's between the young shepherdess Perdita and the king, Polixenes. It revolves around gardening, but they are actually arguing about nature versus artificiality.
It is one of Shakespeare's most profound meditations on what it actually means to be authentic.
Right. So Perdita is handing out flowers to her guests, but she explicitly refuses to plant carnations and streaked gillyflowers. She actually calls them nature's bastards.
A strong stance.
Very strong. Her reasoning is that she has heard there is an art, essentially crossbreeding, or what we would call agricultural modification, that, quote, shares with great creating nature. She finds the idea of modifying nature to create something new to be fundamentally dishonest.
And Polixenes counters with an argument that essentially lays the philosophical groundwork for all of human innovation.
Really does.
He acknowledges that, yes, there is an art that mends or changes nature. Humans marry a gentler plant to a wilder stock to create something better. But his profound mic drop moment is when he says, the art itself is nature.
The art itself is nature. I read that and immediately thought of every single technological and ethical debate we are having right now.
Oh, definitely.
Are synthetic materials unnatural? Is genetic modification unnatural? What about artificial intelligence? Polixenes is basically arguing that because human beings are a part of nature, the tools we build, the modifications we make, and the art we invent are simply extensions of human nature. You can't separate the creator from the natural world that produced the creator in the first place.
It is an incredibly compelling framework for accepting technological advancement. If the art itself is nature, then human artifice is just a subset of the natural order.
Right.
But what makes the scene so brilliant, and what Hazlitt deeply respects, is Perdita's reaction. Polixenes' logic is flawless, but Perdita stands her ground.
She does not budge. She basically says, that's a nice philosophy, but I'm still not planting them. She says, I'll not put the dibble in earth to set one slip of them. A dibble being the tool used to plant the seeds.
She completely refuses to use the technology.
And she reveals why. She compares modifying the flowers to painting her face with makeup so that a youth would desire her. She draws this direct line between agricultural modification and personal artifice.
Wait, so if Polixenes is right and art is nature, doesn't that justify all the artificiality?
That's the question.
Doesn't that mean putting on a highly curated persona for social media or navigating office politics with a totally fake smile is just part of our natural human toolkit?
That is the exact tension the scene creates. Polixenes argues for the legitimacy of the tool. Perdita argues for the integrity of the soul using it.
She is taking a very hard stance on authenticity.
Yeah. She recognizes that even if a modification is technically natural by philosophical definition, it introduces a layer of pretense. It feels fake to her, and she refuses to present herself or her garden falsely.
It's a profound modern meditation on how much we are actually willing to curate ourselves just to fit into the world. At what point does using the dibble, the photo filter, the corporate jargon, the curated persona, turn us into nature's bastards?
Which brings us perfectly to the character who is completely crushed by the burden of his own curation. Parolles in All's Well That Ends Well. If Perdita refuses to wear a mask, Parolles is literally nothing but a mask. Hazlitt describes him as a parasite, a coward, and a hanger-on. There's this brutal line from an old lord in the play who looks at Parolles and just says, "The soul of this man is in his clothes."
That is such a devastating insult. Parolles is the 17th century embodiment of fake it till you make it.
Total stolen valor.
Exactly. He's all swagger. He boasts constantly about his military prowess, specifically contriving this ridiculous, incredibly dangerous plan to go behind enemy lines and recover a lost drum.
Right, his famous drum.
He has zero intention of actually doing it. He is desperately trying to maintain the illusion of heroism.
But his comrades see right through him.
Yeah.
So they decide to call his bluff in the most humiliating way possible.
It's brutal.
They ambush him in the dark, they pretend to be the enemy, and they blindfold him. And the moment he thinks his life is in actual danger, his entire persona just evaporates.
Instant.
He instantly sells out his friends, gives up all their military secrets, and just begs for his life. And then they pull the blindfold off. He is utterly irrevocably exposed in front of everyone he was trying so hard to impress.
He hits absolute rock bottom. The facade is entirely destroyed. He has lost his reputation, his status, his honor. But the psychological mechanism of what happens next is extraordinary.
This is the crazy part.
Instead of despairing or trying to rebuild the lie, he experiences a moment of profound somatic liberation. He realizes the worst possible thing has happened, and he is still breathing.
Yeah.
He says, "Safest in shame, being fooled by foolery thrive. There's place and means for every man alive." And he concludes with this incredible declaration, "Simply the thing I am shall make me live."
It's the ultimate cure for imposter syndrome.
It really is.
Think about how many people walk into their offices or their social circles completely terrified of being found out. We maintain these exhausting, meticulously crafted avatars. We put our souls in our clothes.
And the anxiety of maintaining that lie is like a constant low-level drip of cortisol.
Exactly. The physiological toll of maintaining a false self is immense. Your nervous system is constantly on high alert, just waiting for the ambush.
What Parolles experiences is the parasympathetic relief of the ego completely collapsing. He no longer has to carry the heavy armor of being a fake hero. He can just be the coward he naturally is and eat, drink, and sleep soft.
So liberating.
The lesson for the modern listener is not an endorsement of cowardice, obviously. It is a revelation about the immense, exhausting burden of pretense. There is a bizarre, paradoxical safety in hitting rock bottom and just admitting exactly who and what you are. The truth, even when it's humiliating, requires 0 calories to maintain.
Simply, the thing I am shall make me live. That is a foundational shift in how to exist in the world. So we've laid out the anatomy of passion, the tension of authenticity, and the relief of exposure. Now we really need to translate this into the practical how-to.
Let's get practical.
How do we take Hazlitt's observations and operationalize them in daily life? Let's start with overcoming the paranoia we saw in Leontes.
Applying the Leontes lesson requires an aggressive level of self-awareness. When you find yourself spinning in that thorny labyrinth, when your heart rate is up and you feel confounded with passion, you have to force a pause and interrogate your own motives.
You have to catch yourself in the act.
You must ask yourself, am I acting like Leontes with Camilla right now?
Meaning, am I picking a fight just so I can use the friction to justify my bad mood?
Exactly.
Because I will admit, that is a highly effective, incredibly toxic way to discharge anxiety. You feel out of control, so you deliberately provoke a partner or a colleague, and the very moment they push back, you say, "See, you're always against me."
It's a defense mechanism to avoid looking at the irrationality of your own emotion. To step out of that labyrinth, you must demand hard evidence from yourself. When your anxious brain asks, "Is whispering nothing?" the practice is to answer out loud, "Yes. Until I have empirical facts, whispering is literally just whispering."
You had to consciously refuse to connect dots that aren't there.
You must stop seeking opposition to fuel your internal fires.
Okay, the second practice is questioning your ambitions, which we draw from the Helen lesson. Helen loves Bertram. He is a bright, particular star, completely out of her league socially and economically. She knows that the hind that would be mated by the lion must die for love.
But her sentiment doesn't manifest as a vision board or sad journal entries.
No, it doesn't.
This is a critical distinction for anyone pursuing a goal that seems wildly out of reach, whether that's a massive career pivot, a creative endeavor, or a relationship. Helen's approach relies on proactive skill.
Right.
The text specifically highlights her success in restoring the King of France's health using a hereditary prescription left by her father. She utilizes actual competence and undeniable value to bridge the massive gap between her current station and her ultimate ambition.
She doesn't wait for the universe to just grant her wish. She goes to the king and basically says, I can solve your unsolvable problem, and in return, you will give me the lion. So the reflection for us is, if you want the lion, what are you actively doing to elevate your competence? Are you relying on mere wishing, or are you cultivating the virtue, the skill, and the proactive value that makes your ascent undeniable?
It's about building real leverage. And our third practice is the Parolles exercise, finding your authentic baseline.
This one is tough. The question to ask yourself is, where is your soul in your clothes? Where are you maintaining false pretensions as a means to live?
It requires a brutally honest audit of your daily interactions. Look at the meetings you attend, the way you speak about your accomplishments, the persona you project online.
Right.
Where are you boasting about bringing off a metaphorical drum that you have absolutely no intention or ability to retrieve? The practical experiment here is to identify one area where the pretense is exhausting you and intentionally drop the facade.
Just let it go.
Admit a gap in your knowledge at work. Tell a friend you are actually really struggling. See if the sky falls, or if, like Parolles, you suddenly find yourself breathing a massive sigh of relief in the safety of just being simply the thing I am.
I think we all have a drum we need to stop pretending to chase. But as much as I love these practical takeaways, we have to address the friction here. Not everything Hazlitt praises in these centuries-old plays goes down easy today.
No, definitely not.
There are massive obstacles to growth if we try to view this through a strictly modern lens. Let's talk about the resistance to what Hazlitt calls saint-like resignation.
This is arguably the largest cultural friction point in the material. Hazlitt heaps praise upon Hermione for her saint-like resignation and patient forbearance when she is falsely accused of infidelity by Leontes, publicly humiliated, and thrown in prison.
Which is horrific.
And similarly, he praises Helen for her relentless pursuit of a man who explicitly disdains her, lauding her for never violating the most scrupulous nicety of female modesty.
I'm going to push back hard on Hazlitt here because my modern alarm bells are deafening.
I don't blame you.
If a friend today was falsely accused by her husband, stripped of her dignity, and thrown in a literal jail cell, and she reacted with patient forbearance, we wouldn't praise her. We would stage an intervention. We would tell her to hire a brutal lawyer and scorch the earth.
Which is a very normal modern reaction.
And Shakespeare actually gives us a character who does that, Paulina. Paulina delivers these zealous and spirited remonstrances against the king. She gets right in his face and yells at him about his injustice. Frankly, the modern world values Paulina's aggressive empowerment way more than Hermione's silent suffering. I don't buy that Hermione is strong just for taking the abuse.
That reaction is entirely valid by modern standards, which heavily prioritize active boundary setting and vocal resistance against injustice. And we shouldn't discard the value of Paulina's fire. But the reason this is an obstacle to growth is that modern listeners often conflate patience with weakness.
We assume if you aren't fighting back loudly, you're just a victim.
Exactly. But what Hazlitt sees in Hermione is a profound, almost terrifying inner strength. Go back to his definition of sentiment, a heart that reposes almost entirely upon itself.
Meaning her reality isn't dictated by the king's delusion.
Precisely the point. Hermione knows she is innocent. The king's chaotic, violent paranoia does not change her internal truth. If she were to match his screaming, thrashing energy, she would be allowing his sickness to dictate her behavior.
Ah, I see.
By maintaining her patient forbearance, she is exercising absolute emotional sovereignty. She is essentially saying, your chaos will not break my peace. I do not need you to validate my innocence for it to be real.
Emotional sovereignty. That renames the behavior entirely. It's not weakness. It is the ultimate flex of self-control. It's refusing to let someone else's brokenness become your internal weather.
The value here isn't instructing modern listeners to accept abuse or remain in toxic situations. The value is learning how to remain centered in your own virtue when the world acts unjustly, rather than immediately matching the chaotic energy of the person wronging you.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But there is another obstacle that messes with our modern sensibilities, and it has to do with our deep desire for justice. We brought him up earlier. The thief, Leontes.
Ah, the sturdy beggar.
Hazlitt calls him a very pleasant, thriving rogue. All the Leontes lies, cheats, picks pockets, and swindles the shepherds. And Hazlitt notes, almost with glee, that Leontes escapes with complete impunity at the end of the play. He actually calls this escape the best feather in the cap of all knavery.
This is deeply uncomfortable for the modern listener because our culture is obsessed with strict karmic justice.
Yes, we are.
We structure our narratives, our movies, our true crime deep dives, our online outrage cycles around the foundational premise that the bad guy must be punished. We demand that the universe balance the scales. The fact that a rogue thrives, causes harm, and just walks away whistling totally challenges our fundamental desire for fairness.
So why is Hazlitt smiling about it? Why should we find wisdom in a con man getting away with it?
Because it is a relentlessly realistic observation of how the world actually operates.
The world isn't fair.
Exactly. The world is not a perfectly balanced scale. It contains pleasant rogues. Autolycus represents the chaotic trickster archetype that exists in every single society. And often, those rogues survive and thrive not through deep malice, but through supreme adaptability, humor, and a complete lack of rigid attachment.
They don't play by the rules, so they don't get weighed down by them.
The wisdom here is accepting that not every wrong is righted. Sometimes a quick wit and a complete lack of shame will get a rogue further than strict morality gets a saint.
Which is hard to swallow.
It is, but it teaches us to hold our rigid expectations of universal justice a little more loosely. If we demand that the universe punish every single Autolycus, we will spend our entire lives perpetually outraged. Recognizing the trickster's survival instinct allows us to navigate a messy world with a bit more grace and a lot less naive shock.
That requires a significant amount of nuance to accept without becoming totally cynical, which leads us into the necessity of wisdom with discernment.
Very important.
We cannot just swallow everything Hazlitt or Shakespeare presents whole. We have to separate the timeless psychological truth from the heavy, often toxic baggage of the eras they were writing in. Let's look at the illusion of the noble peasant.
This is a vital area for discernment. So in The Winter's Tale, Perdita is raised from infancy by a humble, uneducated shepherd in a rural cottage. Yet she possesses this incredible innate grace and majesty. When King Polixenes sees her, he is totally stunned.
Right.
He says nothing she does or seems, but smacks of something greater than herself, too noble for this place. Camillo literally calls her the queen of curds and cream.
Now, spoiler alert, we know she is secretly a princess, the lost daughter of Leontes and Hermione, and Hazlitt notes that the fine romance of the poetry is ultimately reconciled to strict court etiquette when her true identity is revealed at the end.
And here is exactly where we must actively intervene as modern readers. Shakespeare is leaning heavily into the ancient, deeply ingrained social assumption that true grace, nobility, and exceptional character are biologically inherited via aristocratic DNA.
Which is a terrible assumption.
Right. The implication is she is noble because she has royal blood, completely independent of her environment or her humble upbringing.
Yeah, that does not fly today. We fundamentally reject the idea that your bloodline or your birth class determines your character or your capacity for grace.
So we must separate the beautiful, enduring elements of Perdita's character from the classism of the era. What we should actually admire is her grounded resilience.
Like when the king threatens her.
Exactly. When the king discovers his son is courting her, he threatens her with a cruel death and completely ruins the engagement. And she doesn't panic and she doesn't beg. She says, "I was not much afraid. This dream of mine, being now awake, I'll queen it no inch farther, but milk my ewes and weep."
That is a stunning display of fortitude.
It really is. She is perfectly willing to step down, accept reality, and return to her baseline without losing her dignity.
We can absolutely endorse that strength, but we have to reject the Elizabethan idea that she only has that strength because she secretly has the DNA of a king.
Yeah.
Nobility is a choice of character, not a biological birthright.
Exactly. And we need to apply that exact same intense discernment to Helen in All's Well that ends well. We've praised her quiet endurance, her self-sustaining sentiment, and her proactive skill, but let's look at the actual mechanics of how she gets her happy ending. She secures Bertram through a massive, highly questionable stratagem.
The infamous bed trick.
Yes. So Bertram refuses to be her husband unless she can get his ancestral ring from his finger and become pregnant with his child. Two things he intends to make impossible by fleeing to a war and swearing never to touch her.
He really hates her.
He does. So Helen discovers he is trying to seduce a young woman named Diana. Helen disguises herself as Diana, takes her place in the dark bedroom, secures the ring, gets pregnant, and forces Bertram to fulfill his conditions. And when the trick is revealed, they are miraculously reconciled.
Hazlitt praises her persevering gratitude and the absolute purity of her affection. And look, we could admire her strategic brilliance. She is undeniably a genius. But we have to urge the listener to be highly discerning about the object of all that devotion, because Bertram is awful.
He is. Hazlitt himself acknowledges that Bertram is full of willful stubbornness and youthful petulance. He lies, he abandons his responsibilities, and he treats Helen with absolute disdain.
He's the worst.
But the ancient literary trope insists that securing the marriage is the ultimate victory, the necessary happy ending, regardless of the man's behavior.
Today, we look at that and say, Helen, you are brilliant. You cured the king. You orchestrated a masterclass in strategy. Why are you wasting all of that on this guy?
Exactly. The wisdom for us is separating the admirable tenacity of the heroine from the unworthiness of the prize.
It is a beautiful thing to be devoted, to be strategic, and to endure. But apply intense discernment regarding who receives the monumental gift of your perseverance. Do not use your brilliant stratagems to trap a petulant boy. Use your power to build a life with someone who actually recognizes your value in the light.
That distinction prevents us from romanticizing toxic persistence. It allows us to admire the machinery of Helen's sentiment without endorsing the outcome.
As we start to pull the lens back, I want to touch on an insight that Hazlitt provides near the end of his commentary, because it really reframes how we view all of human storytelling. He makes a really compelling point about where these stories actually come from. He points out that Shakespeare didn't invent the plot of All's Well That Ends Well out of thin air. He borrowed it from Boccaccio.
Hazlitt takes a significant detour to passionately defend Boccaccio here. He notes that Boccaccio had acquired an unfair reputation as a writer of mere lascivious tales or idle jests, primarily because critics focused on his comedic attacks on corrupt monks and the grosser elements of human behavior. But Hazlitt argues that Boccaccio actually carried human sentiment to its very highest purity and perfection, drawing on the floating oral traditions of his time.
He essentially calls him the great painter of the human heart. And from that defense, Hazlitt makes this incredibly bold, almost shocking claim about originality in literature. He says that Homer only appears to be the most original author for no other reason than that we can trace the plagiarism no farther.
That is a staggering observation, isn't it?
It really is.
Hazlitt points out that Chaucer borrowed the stories of Griselda and the Knight's Tale directly from Boccaccio. Shakespeare borrowed from Boccaccio and Holinshed. Boccaccio borrowed from earlier medieval traditions. What we are seeing here is the shared, endlessly deep well of human tradition.
If we connect this to the broader human concern, it changes how we view our own emotional lives. We often feel like our specific anxieties, our unique heartbreaks, or our complex imposter syndrome are entirely unprecedented. We think we are the first ones to feel this specific cocktail of pain.
Because there is a bit of narcissism in human suffering. But the truth is, there are very few new emotions. From the ancient Greeks of Homer, to the 14th century Italians of Boccaccio, to the 17th century English of Shakespeare, down to the podcasts and digital anxieties of today, the core concerns remain identical.
It's all the same stuff.
Hazlitt references the wild, supernatural interest of the story of Honoria, the picturesque beauty of the poisoned holiday lovers, the unalterable affection in Geronimo. These are all just variations on the central human theme.
Jealousy that chokes the breath. Love that endures in silence.
The terror of being exposed as a fraud. The desperate desire for authenticity in a synthetic world. We are all drinking from the same ancient well.
It is strangely comforting to realize that the thorny labyrinth you find yourself in today is the exact same labyrinth a fictional king was lost in 400 years ago, which was based on a story from an even older master who was probably adapting a tale told around a fire 1,000 years before that.
You are definitely not alone in your neuroses.
The human heart has been beating to the same chaotic, beautiful, predictable rhythm for millennia.
And our only job is to learn how to listen to that rhythm with a bit more clarity, a bit more discernment, and a lot less panic.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day. We looked at two very different ways of navigating the pressure of existence today. Think about Parolles, the boastful soldier whose soul was entirely in his clothes.
Right.
He spent all his energy frantically maintaining a fake image until the ambush came, and he was humiliated into freedom. And then think about Perdita, the young shepherdess who stubbornly refused to wear the metaphorical clothes of artifice. She rejected the crossbred gillyflowers, refusing to compromise her authenticity or put the dibble in the earth, even to appease a king.
Two totally different approaches.
In your own life, when the stakes are high and the pressure mounts, which path are you taking? Do you retreat into the exhausting, cortisol-drenched safety of pretending to be someone you aren't, constantly terrified that your bluff will be called? Or do you stand firm like Perdita, fully prepared to let the illusion go, step down from the pretense, and just milk your ewes and wheat in absolute unshakable peace? What would happen today if you stopped fighting the chaos, dropped the act, and finally embraced the true nature of who you are? That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.